So, I think there is a problem, and I think there's an opportunity to step in, which is what I'd like to try and do with this book that Silva mentioned, is the body language myth, understanding gesture in language and communication. And I'm writing this at the moment. And I'm thinking about how I'm going to take readers from this idea of body language, which is so pervasive and so popular, to something more technical. And I want to take them to linguistic bodies and embodied language. They use the same words, so it's just a matter of shuffling them around. Now obviously body language is so sexy, it sells. Body language sells. And linguistic bodies, embodied language, they're so technical and they're difficult to understand. But it's worth at least trying, because behind body language there's maybe some outdated research, there's some older research that played a role in establishing certain studies of gesture in different kinds of fields, but it doesn't reflect what we know today. It doesn't reflect gesture studies, multimodal interaction, or embodied cognitive science. And as I said at the beginning, there aren't other researchers who have tried to do this yet, except for Beatty, Rethinking Body Language. So I'm building on his work, and his is a cognitive psychological approach, and it's entirely based on video recordings of individual speakers either narrating or conversing with a partner, and it's entirely based on their gestures as well. So I want to move from a cognitive psychological perspective to gesture studies, multimodal interaction and embodied cognitive science, which are quite different, and also show how it applies to several domains of communication. And I'm going to choose those domains where the body language myth has done the most damage. So we're talking about, I mean, as you saw in some of that video, workplace communication, classroom communication, political discourse, and the social encounter. Now, these body language experts say that if you buy their books, they will help you get a date, they will help you get that job you've always wanted, they will help you be the confident person that you really can be. I'm not sure I can promise you that, but I can certainly promise you if you do switch, like the student I showed you, from body language to linguistic bodies with embodied language, then you might have that sort of light bulb moment that the student had where you're suddenly enthralled by a new topic and discovered some new knowledge. And also, when someone then says in a conversation, yeah, I could tell by his body language, you can say, hold on a second. Have a seat. Let's talk about this. Okay, so I'm going to do this in the book through logic. I'm going to try reasoning by logic. Tomorrow night I'm going into a concert hall or a cinema, I'm not sure yet, in Berlin to give a science slam, which is 10 minutes presentation where you're supposed to present some research in an accessible and entertaining way. And I'm going to do it by analogy, where I'm going to show a video of something that is unrelated to gesture, and I'm going to get people interested in that first of all, and then slowly move them into gesture studies and multimodal interaction. So if you're interested in that, I'll let you know where it is a bit later, the science slam. But I can't reason with logic because that audience will have been drinking, probably. But in the book, I'm thinking about students, I'm thinking about academics from other fields as well, who are interested in maybe challenging their view or changing their perspective, and also for some gesture researchers who would like to know how I'm going to construct this argument. So I'm going to try this with you now, and I want you to see if it sort of sounds logical or it sounds persuasive. I think one way to begin will be to say, okay, our bodies have evolved to acquire language from birth. I think that's an undeniable claim. When we're born, our bodies are ready for language. Physiologically, biologically, neurologically ready. As soon as we're born, language kicks in. And I don't mean that the hypothesis of innate grammar or language genes or language organs. I don't think I need to deal with that. Let me just give you one observation, the kind that I'm thinking of, formulated by Evans, who says that children come into the world biologically prepared for language, from speech production apparatus, you know, the lungs, the vocal tract, the vocal folds, the tongue, the teeth, the lips. We're ready for language in that sense. To information processing capacity, we're born with general cognitive abilities that apply to language. Human infants are neurobiologically equipped to acquire spoken language in a way no other species is. Okay. So in some sense, we are born with, or very quickly develop, bodies with language. Bodies with language is already, I think, a huge step forward from body language. It's keeping the same words, it's keeping a relation between them, but it's just separating them a little bit. Whereas body language is a kind of language, bodies with language, we're now talking about a kind of body. So shifting the focus, I think people will be interested in this body, the way I present it. I know there's a problem with this with. Bodies with language. One of the reviewers for the proposal said that this was an unhappy term because it brings with it notions of people carrying things around like an accessory. So I want to say it's not the with of person with bags, but the with of coffee with milk. The former can be separated, but the latter cannot. The latter cannot. Apparently there's some kind of machine you can get to separate them back out, but there'll always be some chemicals or some residue intermingled with each other. So that's one thing I'm thinking about, but let me introduce a bit more. What this with does is it places language as integral to the body, and I think that's a good starting point. But another reason, and I'll go into more detail about this a bit later, is there's this book come out called Linguistic Bodies. And they take a developmental cognitive perspective, so the way we slowly acquire or become skillful users of language in an environment that's already full of language. As soon as we're born, they say we're born into an enlanguaged environment and we become progressively embedded and skillful interactants in that context, in that kind of environment. They say we live in language, we get swept up by conversations or gossip, depending. So they say we have linguistic bodies in that sense. So I'm sort of thinking, okay, it's bodies with language or bodies in language, or maybe I'll just say bodies with or in language. And when we analyse this body with language, we avoid these separations and distinctions that I mentioned before, on which body language has been based. And it paves the way to introduce more complex, technical, but scientifically robust ideas of linguistic bodies with embodied language. Alright, embodied language I won't go into. You can read about that in cognitive linguistics, cognitive neuroscience, or in multimodal interaction, where they say that speaking is itself an embodied activity. So that's what I mean there by embodied language. But I want to move to linguistic bodies. So there are two distinct but compatible uses of this term. The first one is the treatment of language from an inactive cognitive science perspective, in the recent book by De Paulo, Cafari and De Jager. And the second notion of linguistic bodies I'll take from the linguistic approach to bodily communication, especially gesture, that's been developed by Cornelia Muller, Silva Ladvig, Jana Bressum, Ellen Frick, here in the Towards a Grammar of Gesture project. And there are monographs coming out that are based on this approach. So the Impulse to Gesture, but also Silva Ladvig's forthcoming book, Cognitive Grammar Multimodal, and Jana Bressum's Repetitions in Gesture. And I think that these will all be examples of a linguistic body in some sense. So my own work was on negation, and negation is a linguistic concept, and I showed how very much negation can shape the way that we gesture and determine how and when and why we use gesture. So that was, I look back on that now and say that, yeah, that was my way into a linguistic body. So I'll just describe the differences between the two approaches. Togog's linguistic bodies, they take a linguistic approach to language, which means that they put language and gesture on the same par and say that there's structural similarity and integration with language. So Jana Bressum, for example, says, we call our approach linguistic because gestures can be segmented and classified, they show regularities and structures on a level of form and meaning, they have a potential for combinatorics and hierarchical structures. And we see this also, for example, in the research on multimodal constructions. And another approach within the linguistic bodies of Taugog is Cornelia Muller's the body's potential for language. You know, the body has a huge potential for an array of gestures that we can use, from the gestures that we perform with speech all the way up into sign language. And sign language has much more linguistic structure that can be identified on a parallel with spoken language. So for example, phonology, morphology, lexis, syntax. I'll just give you an example. The sign for give in American Sign Language. I don't know what is the sign in German Sign Language? Okay, open hand, two hands maybe. Alright, so give in American Sign Language is like this. Okay. But if I wanted to say give repeatedly, which is an adverb, which would be called an adverb in spoken language, and therefore morphology, like this, give repeatedly. If I want to say give to you, I can direct the sign to you, the sign give to you. Now, how do you think I would say you give to me? Exactly, yeah. And that's grammar. Because if I do this, then it means one thing, but if I do this, then it means another thing. So it's a grammar that's based on iconicity and principles of three-dimensional space. But it has that same level of structure. Now this one's the Inactivist Linguistic Bodies, and it was published only recently in 2018. And they have a different starting point, whereas the linguistic bodies of Taugog start with the form of the gesture. And they have a form-based approach. De Paulo, Cafari and De Jager begin with the experience of being alive from the moment you're born to gradually as you become a member of a linguistic community, and your body becomes increasingly linguistic in that sense that you know how to interact in certain situations, and you know you become a skillful user of your body for language. Their book is structured beginning with participatory sense-making all the way up to linguistic bodies that includes being able to use grammar interactively. And I wasn't surprised when I came across which model they were taking for gestures, because they've taken, they mentioned Taugog towards the end of their book. And they talk about recurrent gestures and conventionality. But they have a difference to it. They say that the explanation from, for example, Silva Ladvig and Jana Bressam's work on articulatory phrases, gesture phrases, still requires somehow locating gesture forms in individual minds. You know, we talk about these repertoires of recurrent gestures, and we say that they're in the community, but they're also entrenched in cognitive units. That's something that we find in the recurrent gesture research. So for example, in the paper for multimodal constructions, when we look at the away gesture, and you see how that's conventionalized into a unit. And they say, we're in a position instead to see symbolic skills and sensitivities involving recurrent gesturing as live events of incorporating and incarnating articulations available in and for a community. Expressive and referential as well as pragmatic functions arise as the result of bodily movements that in the course of regulating and responding to interactive dynamics are always becoming articulate. So I'm still trying to figure out how these two approaches go together, but I think that there's a lot more recent work from, for example, Cornelia and Silva and Jana, and also by myself, that kind of brings recurrent gestures more into this inactive perspective that they're developing. So for example, even a paper back in 2013, Cornelia and Silva wrote as gestures as sensory motor experiences, the felt experiences in a phenomenological sense. So using a similar framework to the linguistic bodies framework. And then there's how recurrent gestures mean, and cinematic metaphor, and the recent papers we published in the 4E special issue. So I think that actually they're not so distinct, and that they will fit together quite well. And then we have the special issue on recurrent gestures coming. We'll be able to write about this in there and address some of these concerns. And also the panel at ICLC Japan, where we're going to broaden the analytical unit of recurrent gestures outwards a little bit to include the environment, to include objects and to include interaction over sequences. Okay, so that's the second part, that's the proposal. And it's not quite ready yet, but some of the basic guidelines are there.
Mm-hmm.